So we've been in 1 Corinthians as a church, which is a letter that the Apostle Paul, or one of the early church leaders after the time of Jesus' time on earth and death and resurrection, and ascension into heaven, he came on the scene and started taking the message of Jesus beyond Israel out into the entire Roman Empire, far reaches of the Roman Empire. And one of the places he took it was to Corinth, a city in ancient Greece. And they had been corresponding sometime, probably for a couple of years after Paul left and moved onward to start other churches, other places, and talking to him for advice on different issues they were facing. Sometimes they would send delegates, or Paul would hear from other travelers what was happening, and he would send letters back or respond to their letters to address different needs. And so that's what's happening here. And just to give you a little context for what we're coming up to today, I want to start out by saying I think this morning what we're talking about are some of the most heavily debated verses in the New Testament. So grab onto the seat in front of you and hold on, because it's going to be a little bit of a wild ride. And there are people with a lot more education and degrees and information than I have that line up very differently on some of these things. Also, if you survey what Christians have written throughout history, you'll find a lot of different opinions. And so what I'm going to share this morning is my best take on these verses. I've done research and I've tried to understand them in light of the context of this book that we've been going through. But that having been said, there are a lot of great, well-informed people that have more degrees than I do that would say I'm totally wrong on what I'm about to share with you. And so take it with a grain of salt, but at the same time, understand that no matter how we interpret the Bible, it needs to fit in the context of what's happening. And so I think what I'm going to present might be different than what you typically may hear on this passage, but I do think there's a strong argument for it fitting in the context of what Paul's really trying to lead the Corinthians into. And that is this question of, again, honor versus humility, like you see on the screen, because they are all about ways to draw honor and attention to themselves. Their society has pushed them that way, press them that way from birth on. In order to get ahead in ancient Corinth, you have to kind of be for yourself and get a leg up in society and compete. But the way of Jesus is anything but competitive, and oftentimes it is very humble, and where you're focusing that attention and that love on other people instead of just on yourself. And I think that's what we see this morning. Last week we finished up a section where Paul has been encouraging the Corinthians to consider whether or not to exercise freedom or to restrict certain freedoms and rights based on situations, trying to do the thing that's most loving in consideration of other people, not just best for their own interests. And it's been in the scope of society and life. And what I think Paul is doing in chapter 11 is focusing their attention from society, their community, and how they can set aside their freedoms to consider other people in their community and maybe families, to specifically the church gathering, and how when the Corinthians are meeting together, like we are perhaps on Sunday mornings in someone's home or elsewhere in ancient Corinth, when they're together as God's people, how can they navigate these issues then? Do they need to set aside any of their rights and freedoms when they're gathered for worship? Next week, we're going to talk about another example of how they need to set aside some freedoms and rights and liberties in the worship gathering. And so I think what we're reading about this morning is nestled nicely between those two concepts, right? When do we deny ourselves for the good of other people around us? And when do we deny ourselves certain rights or freedoms in the worship gathering? And I think this is an introduction into that. So that's the slant that I'm going to take on things this morning. So let's go ahead and get into this today. I'll try to be timely. You'll probably leave with lots of questions. So if you want to have side conversations, I can go down that rabbit hole with you at some point in time, and I'd be happy to. But this is going to be an overview. We have people in our church who have been trying to mine the depths of the Bible for probably 30, 40, 50 years, and then we have people who are very new to the Bible, and so I'm trying to keep everyone on the same page. So it's going to be kind of a flyover, but at the same time, I'm not going to avoid verses. So that's how we'll handle this today. But I'm going to title this Equality and Authority in Worship. I think you'll see why that title comes along in a few moments today. But we're in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 1 through 16. I'm going to read through those as we go. I'll have them up on the screen, or you can follow along in Bibles or on your phones as well. But this is how Paul begins that passage. He says, "Imitate me as I also imitate Christ." And he's not just talking about in every single way of my life. He's talking about with regards of when certain situations lead him to deny his own rights or freedoms or liberties for the good of other people. And he's just spent 3 chapters, chapters 8, 9, and 10, talking about what that looks like. So he's saying, imitate me in that specific way, even as I imitate Christ, because Christ is the ultimate example of humility who laid aside his rights and his privileges for the sake of us. He goes on, he says, now I praise you because you remember me in everything and hold fast to the traditions just as I delivered them to you. So he's going back and he's going to examine some kind of like, I guess, customs that he might have passed along to the Corinthians during his time there. Paul spent at least 18 months, maybe up to 24 months in Corinth, starting this church, and he's been out of the picture for maybe 2 or 3 years at this point elsewhere, planting churches. Other people have come in to lead in that church, and so other ideas have come in, and when different people come in, people start to do things different ways. And it seems like they had stepped away from some of the protocols or traditions that Paul had introduced, and they're doing things differently, but Paul had some concerns, and maybe some other people who wrote this letter to him that he is responding back to had concerns as well. So, verse 3, and this is like, now we're going to dive in deep, because with these verses, there have been so many different interpretations that it has led Christians to conclude a lot of different things. Some of those things I personally believe are very erroneous, very much in conflict with the Bible and Scripture, very demeaning to people, especially women. And so I'm going to give you my perspective. And again, feel completely free to disagree. And you have every right to your own impressions on this. But hear me out, because I've looked into some things as well. So I want to give you maybe a different perspective. He says, I want you to know that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of the woman, and God is the head of Christ. So with this, we have to confront one of our natural instincts. And our instincts are to apply our current definitions and our meanings to Bible words and concepts. So when we talk about the word head in our culture, what kinds of ideas does that conjure up in our minds, in our heads, right? First of all, it's this thing that sits on top of our shoulders, right? I have a headache. This part of my body, it hurts. So maybe that's what Paul means in this verse. He's talking about their literal heads, their noggins, right? Or we have these concepts like the head coach or the department head. And when we say head in that sense, we're talking about the person who's in charge, the person who's in control, person in authority or leadership who makes decisions. Then we use head in this way. I need to go to the head. If you've had a boat, what does that mean? The bathroom, right? So maybe that's what Paul's talking about, right? I'm in my head. That doesn't mean our head, it means our mind, right? I'm thinking about something, distracted. A head taller, right? They're about 8 or 9 inches above someone. 50 head of cattle, it's like a unit of measurement. Or we can say the headwaters of the Mississippi River. We're talking about the source of the Mississippi. So when we use that metaphor of a head, even in our own language, we have about 7 or 8 or 9 different options of what that could mean. We face the same thing when we look at the Bible and we read that, because it gets really awkward really fast to say that Christ is the literal head of every person. Do you have a Jesus head on top of your shoulders? No. Or the man is the head of the woman. That would be really interesting, wouldn't it, right? If women had men's heads. So we know it's not literal, so it's some kind of metaphor that's happening here. But what does it mean? And this is the first point where people disagree. A lot of well-meaning Christians have a lot of different thoughts. But part of the thing that we have to be careful about is importing our gut reaction of what it means. Well, I feel like it means this, so that's what it must mean. Because what we need to figure out is not what we think it means, it's what Paul meant when he used this. So we're going to try our best to step into the shoes of Paul and the situation in ancient Corinth to try to make sense of this. But that having been said, we're still jumping back in history, so there's a lot of debate on these questions. But whatever the metaphor of head means, it must apply in each of Paul's 3 examples. He uses a connecting word. It says "and" in our translations, but there's a little bit different connector word in Greek, and it implies that all 3 of these concepts are connected. So Christ is the head of every man, and this is the word for male, not the word for human. So he literally is saying Christ is the head of every man or every male. Whatever that means, the fact that the man is the head of the woman needs to be a similar kind of meaning. Head needs to mean the same thing in that comparison. And then the fact that God is the head of Christ needs to mean the same thing in that comparison. And this helps us get down to the meaning, because if we use the wrong meaning for the word head, we get into heresy and all kinds of crazy beliefs really fast, and we can contradict the Bible very easily. And so we're going to talk about a few of those examples for the next 5 minutes or so, and then we'll move into the rest of the passage, which gets even crazier than this verse. Here's a few assumptions and ways people have landed on this throughout history, okay? And most people have their arguments for why they think what they think. And so I don't want to come across as saying, well, I've got all the answers and everyone else is wrong. A lot of people have reasons, but there's been an assumption throughout history, particularly from about 300 AD until like maybe 1900 or even the present, there's been an assumption that head means authority figure. It's one of the most popular interpretations today, so more Christians would land on this than most things. But if you interpret it that way, it does a few things. First of all, if you say Christ is the head of every man, that means people who are following Jesus, and that means people who are atheists and people who are Buddhists and people who could care less, right? And so that's saying every man that's walking the planet is under the authority and the control of Jesus. But that doesn't seem to jive with reality. And so we're subjugating non-religious men to Jesus. We're also subjugating women or possibly wives, because when the Greek language uses the word for women and wife, it's the same word. And so you have to use context to distinguish whether ancient Greek people are talking about husbands and wives or just about men and women. So there's even some debate on this. But if we say that the man is the head of the woman, or the husband is the head of the wife, what we're doing is we're saying, if we assume it means authority figure, we're saying that the husband is in control of the wife. She is subservient, and he is superior in a sense that he's the one in control making the decisions. But where this really goes awry again is with Christ, because if we say that God is the head of Christ, again, we're saying God is the authority figure and Christ is subservient or less than or lesser than or inferior to or less capable than God. And because Christ is God, that creates a theological conflict. So we're demeaning men who are not followers of Jesus. We're really demeaning women, and then we're demeaning Christ, because we're implying he's lesser than God if we assume that's what it means. Because of that reason, a lot of people in the first 200 years of Christianity, so think about 100 AD to 300 AD, a lot of church leaders shied away from that interpretation, which again has been the most popular one throughout history. And they instead favored the one of source, like the head of the Mississippi River, the headwaters, the source, of life, or the source of water. And so they said, well, maybe it means source. So put that into the verse. I want you to know that Christ is the source of every man. You could, I guess, argue that from creation. The man is the source of the woman, which gets a little bit more ambiguous, right? What do we mean by that? Maybe he's talking about Adam being the source of Eve, but he doesn't necessarily say that. And God is the source of Christ. Maybe if you consider a source as something that eternally, exists from and emanates but you can get into kind of tricky waters with that too, because something normally, like if there's a source of something, it implies that that thing has been around before the other thing. That's where it came from. And so that gets a little bit tricky too. But early church leaders did tend to lean that way. Here are my thoughts. My thoughts are actually different on this point. I think the ancient Corinthians would have understood this to refer to somebody with a higher social status. And there are different uses of the word head throughout first century literature, Greek and Roman literature, Jewish literature. But one of the uses has this idea of prominence. And again, remember, this letter is all about honor and humility and a culture that prizes status and honor above many other things. And so in the first century, the head is a metaphor of a higher social status, or you can think of it as honor. If you just want a simple one-word definition, would be head is equivalent to honor, which is why you put a crown on someone's head when they win an Olympic race, or you put a crown on a king's head when you want to show honor, or perhaps you even uncover your head when you want to show honor in the presence of cover your head in the presence of someone greater to show honor to them. And so people, they did a lot of actions around their head to express honor or to receive honor from people. And that's something that we're not as familiar with in our culture. Head doesn't equal honor in our culture, but it was a very common option for the metaphor of head in the first century world. And so I actually believe this is what Paul's driving at here. It also would imply somebody to whom honor is due. And so I think Paul's setting up in the next few verses a situation where people need to be careful about giving honor where honor is due for the betterment of each other and really for the witness and the reputation of the church and the community. So if you bring that into verse 3, what you would get is something like this. But I want you to know that Christ is the focal point of honor of every man. So in their culture, men would have been concerned about bringing honor to themselves and increasing their own status. But with this concept of that metaphor, I think Paul is urging men to now concern themselves with how they can push honor onto Christ and not themselves. It would also bring this meaning into the second phrase: the man is the head of the woman. The man is the focal point of honor of the woman. And this sounds a little bit dicey when we talk about it. It sounds a little uncomfortable. But in their culture, there are certain things that women can do or not do in the public setting in order to either project honor onto their husband or shame their husband, pull honor away from their husband. And because men and women's reputations are so intertwined in that first century world, that how a woman honors her husband in public affects his reputation. But if his reputation in the previous phrase is tied to honoring Christ, the way she honors her husband in a public setting also affects Christ's reputation through that. And so it's a tricky cultural connection that we really don't experience in the same way in our day and age. And then God is the head of Christ. We can read scripture verses about Christ doing things or acting things to bring glory or honor to the Father and his ministry. In fact, he even quotes similar phrases at different points in time, like he is there to bring honor to God. It also gets tricky because he is God. And so, fleshing that out becomes difficult. But I want to propose to you this morning that I think this verse is talking about where honor is placed, and I think that affects how things operate in a worship gathering. So now that we have that confusing verse kind of a little bit addressed from different angles, I'm going to go into some considerations for you. And again, like I said, this is a wild ride. If you read this chapter straight through, you just end up going, what in the world is Paul talking about? That's the honest first impression. So let's walk through some phrases, and I'll give you my take, and I won't take too much time, and you're free to disagree. So here's how we start. Every man who prays or prophesies with something on his head dishonors his head. So Paul, again, trying to follow his logic, it's tricky because he says head twice. And so what he's saying here is every man, male, who prays or prophesies in church takes on a leadership role with something on his head, like a literal covering. They would oftentimes use the corner of the toga. Men would cover their heads with it, or sometimes in Jewish culture, they'd wear a prayer shawl or something like that. And Paul is actually saying that doing that in worship, it dishonors his head, not his physical head, but the one from verse 3. Remember, the head of every man is Christ. And so he's saying that action actually will dishonor Christ. Well, how do you get that, Jason? So here's my explanation. So in Greek, Roman, and Jewish temples, it was customary for men who were leading worship rituals to cover their heads for two reasons. One, it was a sign of their authority to lead. So high priests in, let's say, a temple to Zeus or something, they cover their head when they're performing their rituals, and it signifies on the one hand that they are one of the leaders in the room, right? But at the same time as it signifies their authority and leadership, it also does the exact opposite with reference to their god or their deity or their idol. It's at the same time a cultural expression of honor to their god. They're saying that God has higher status than I have, so I'm going to cover my head as an act of humility, essentially. So Paul had taught the Corinthian men, I believe, this is my interpretation, that this gesture of covering their head has the exact opposite effect in a Christian church. It actually dishonors Christ at a church gathering for two reasons. Because one, it separates the leaders from everyone else, because there's this social idea that when you cover your head leading in worship, you are the leader, you are the authority, you're kind of above everyone else. And so if Christian men cover their head in this way, they're here and everybody else is down here, okay? At the same time, because it separates the men, like it distinguishes the leaders and the authority figures, at the same time, they have this cultural practice in day-to-day life. And so it's not like the temple is the only place where men cover their head. It's also a gesture that men do in the presence of other men socially. And so if you come across, think of it this way. You're in the military, and maybe you salute somebody of higher rank, right? Or you stand at attention in the presence of somebody of higher rank. It's the same kind of thing, only it's social. It's not military. So if you come down the street and you're coming across someone and they're higher than you are socially, you cover your head as a sign of respect to that person, right? And so in a church setting, during the worship service, the person with the covered head is the leader. But before and afterwards, as people are socializing and mixing and gathering, you've got all these people, and depending on who you're with, you got to cover your head or you got to uncover it as a man, because you're talking about where you fit on the social pyramid of everything. And Paul is like, you guys just need to all, again, it's connected with the previous chapters, I think, you all need to refuse your freedom or your right to do this, to keep your head uncovered, right? Because it's more maybe honorable or whatever in certain situations. Like if you're higher status, people cover their head in your presence to show humility. Or, if you're an authority in the worship service, you're going to cover your head while you're serving. And he's saying, instead of throwing all these different social dynamics into the equation about who's more important than who is in what circumstances, why don't you just all uncover your heads the whole time at church? Because the people with uncovered heads are the ones that are highest socially. And he's like, in Christ, you're all valuable. So just keep your heads uncovered, right? And don't have this hierarchy that exists in your society around you. And at the same time, you avoid, is the person who's leading worship, are they more important because they're being more humble in that moment? Like you just throw all of that out the window, and it creates less confusion, less problems. However, if you do that, one of the first tendencies is for women in the congregation to say, since the men are uncovering their heads, maybe that's what's best for us, right? And so Paul's going to address that natural conclusion as well. And he's come to a different conclusion. He says in verse 5, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. So this is a social thing. If you have your head uncovered as a woman in the church gathering, and I think it's talking about husband, not just some man out there. I think it's saying, every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her husband in a sense, or maybe her father if she's younger or something. But since that is one and the same as having her head shaved, this is where it gets really weird, right? For if a woman doesn't cover her head, she should have her hair cut off. But if it's disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, let her head be covered. And as you're reading this in your daily Bible reading, you're just like, this is just crazy. I'm going to skip a couple verses and just go to the next thing, right? But what I think Paul's doing here is he's urging women who are leading in the worship service, because he says praying or prophesying, those are speaking roles. We'll talk more about prophesying in a few chapters. We get into chapters 12 and 14 in a few weeks. But they're doing some sort of leadership role, speaking in the worship service. And he tells them to take the opposite approach because of the way that going uncovered would affect the reputations of their husbands and reflect on Christ. Because here's the cultural background. In Greek and Roman and Jewish culture, married women wore head coverings in public as a sign that they were not available to be propositioned by other men. Okay? Think of it like your wedding ring, ladies, if you have one of those, or an engagement ring maybe, as well. And so they only removed these head coverings in public when they were going through times of mourning or disaster. And then they would remove the head coverings when they were with family, like close family members at home. And so also for a woman to shave her head or have her head shaved, it was an even more extreme form of going uncovered. So more extreme mourning, deep mourning, or it was an act of humiliation or punishment for unfaithfulness that people forced upon a woman. And so Paul's making that comparison with women going without a head covering in church and saying people are going to come to all these wrong cultural conclusions about you. Even though the church is a family, it's still a public setting. And so I believe Paul wants married women to give up the right to uncover their heads, because is this really anything in God's eyes? Like, does he really care about whether your head's covered or not? I think at the very end, Paul's going to land on not really. Not really an issue, maybe, cosmically from God's perspective. But he's saying, I want you to give up the right as married women to uncover your heads, to protect the honor of your husbands and Christ, and really your own, because other people won't think that you're not married when you really are. And then I think there's another reason as well, and that we'll talk about in a moment, but it has to do with that other function of a head covering in the worship setting. Men used it as a sign of authority to show that they were the leaders. They were the humble leaders approaching their God, so they would cover their heads. Even if they were Caesar, on some occasions, would cover his head in a temple to humble himself before that Roman deity. And so it was also a sign that you were in a position of authority. And so I think there's that element when it's related to women as well. Let's go to verse 7. A man should not cover his head because he is the image and glory, and the word glory has to do with honor and reputation of God. So too, woman is the glory, honor, reputation of man. And this is another section where this passage gets really confusing and hotly debated. I put a lot of parentheses here because I translated this verse as literally as possible, because I think from different Bible translations that I've read, people, the way they translate it isn't just based on the literal language, it's based on the way they interpret it and what they think it means. And so I wanted to clear as much of the bias out as possible and just kind of give you literally what the Greek New Testament says if you were to read it. So, verse 8, for man does not come out of woman, but woman out of man. Think about that one. Is that how life really works? How many of you came out of a man? Does it sound a little odd? I think it should. I don't think Paul here is speaking theologically correct. I think he's maybe versing what some of their society believes, their philosophy teaches, or even their religious points of view happen to be in ancient Corinth. Because when you think about these phrases, you think, well, that doesn't really seem like how reality happens. But I think they may have had some ideas culturally that really a woman did come from a man. And even biologically, there were a lot of ideas floating around at this point in time that all the woman does is kind of, help this child incubate inside of her. But the woman is not responsible for any of the DNA or the chromosomes. It's all the man who brings the life into the woman. She's just kind of the incubator. That's the woman's role. And so even their biological understanding is different than what science tells us today. And so they have some confusing ideas. Neither was man created, and this next word can be translated by, through, or for the woman. So neither was man created by the woman, through the woman, or for the woman, but the woman by, through, or for the man. And this is another verse that, again, people have taken and they've run with it and said essentially, well, men weren't made for women were made for men, so we can make women do whatever we want if we're a man, because that's the purpose of a woman, right? Because the Bible says it here in this verse, it's clear. But I don't think Paul, again, is speaking theologically correct. I think he's addressing different cultural perspectives because he's going to correct this view 2 verses later. And why would he say one thing and contradict himself 2 verses later? I don't think that makes sense personally. Then he says, this is why a woman ought to have authority on her head because of the, and your translations are going to say angels, okay? That's another tricky bit, because the word angel in the New Testament, it simply is the word messenger, and sometimes it refers to a heavenly messenger, sometimes it refers to human messengers carrying letters from one church to another or dispatching messages, and sometimes it refers to spies who are like bad messengers, right? Sneaky messengers. And so depending on how this word is understood, it also has different implications. This is one of the most confusing, I think, a couple of verses in the passage as well. And so here's my take on that. Cultural, philosophical, and religious views would have made it easy for the Corinthian men, or possibly for critics, if you interpret that word angels as messengers, maybe people who are looking at the church to deliver a message, maybe not such a good one about what their impressions of that church are. Or perhaps it's talking about real angels. We don't know for certain. But whoever that messenger is referred to, it would make it easy. Their views would have made it easy for those messengers to argue that women had no right to lead in the church, I think. Because let's face it, if we go back a verse and we read things like, man was not created for the woman, but the woman for the man, right? That would easily cause us to land on some kind of a belief like, well, if women are for men, then men are definitely in authority, and so in the church, like, men have authority because the only purpose of a woman is to do a man's bidding, right? And so that would lead to that kind of a conclusion. To argue that women have no right to lead in the church. But again, because head coverings are also this symbol of authority in a religious setting, at least for the men, I think Paul instructs all women, the married ones and the unmarried ones, to cover their heads when they're praying or prophesying. The women who are married would have always had their heads covered. The women who were unmarried would have covered their heads when they're teaching or praying or something of that nature in a church. And I think that Paul instructs them to do that as an equalizer and a picture or reminder that they do have authority from God in the religious setting. Because if you consider what's happening socially, normally the man in charge at the temple, or sometimes priestesses in a few cases, cover their heads and they lead the services at the Roman temples. But when you see women covering their heads in the Christian church, and all the men uncovering their heads, which would be kind of the normal position of men in a temple who were not leading, it almost pushes the men down a notch and elevates the women up a notch as far as who has authority in the room, at least as far as perception is concerned. And my personal thought on this is that Paul was trying to do that, was to promote equality in the church. Verse 11, he kind of hits on this. He says, "In the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, and man is not independent of woman. For just as woman came from man, so man comes through woman, and all things come from God." And so, again, he seems to be correcting the ideas in verses 8 and 9 that we just visited with a more biblical approach of what things are like in the Lord or in faith in Jesus. He corrects seemingly the unequal perceptions of men and women by highlighting the interdependence and the equality of men and women in the Lord. That's what those two verses just did, verses 11 and 12. And I think he's pointing both men and women to the only one who's truly deserving of honor, which is God. Because there's a lot of dynamics with honor and shame in their culture, and the men are trying to get honor, and the women are kind of like being pressured to honor their husbands so that the men can get more honor, which brings their honor up. And Paul's saying the one who really deserves honor is God. So as we choose what things to exercise freedoms on and what things to deny our freedoms on, let's consider what's going to honor God, not just honor people. He says, "Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered?" And now this is something where, again, it gets confusing. There are a lot of things in here that make you just say, what in the world is Paul talking about? But he says, is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? And he's going to present an argument. And this argument really doesn't have a basis in the Bible. I personally think that what he's doing is he's appealing to Epicurean philosophy, which is one of the major three philosophies floating around in the Greek realm of thought. I think he's just coming from a different angle and saying, look, let's set aside the Bible for a second, and let's just think about this the way that you think about life, some of your philosophy. He says, doesn't even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her as a covering. Now, this is another verse that people have used throughout the centuries to say it is sin for a man to have long hair and it is a sin for a woman to have short hair. People have interpreted it this way. But again, if you look at the Bible, I think he's using Epicurean philosophy, which is being guided by nature and what's most natural It's acting in accord or harmony with nature. I think Paul is kind of just appealing to one of their own arguments. And by implication, short hair represents the head covering, and also represents uncovered heads, and long hair represents a head covering in his thought as well. But I think he's saying, like, those are scenarios, those talk about what's appropriate for men and women. But at the same time, if you look at that in the Bible, is that the way things play out? Because in the Jewish faith, in Old Testament Israel, one of the most dedicated groups of people, were the Nazarites. Nazarites were people, just anybody, who came to the temple and said, I want to make a vow. I'm going to promise to do something for the Lord for a period of time. And so to publicly demonstrate or symbolize my promise, I'm not going to cut my hair for the entire time of my promise. And some people, like Samson, were Nazarites from birth, but many people would have been Nazarites for multiple years. Paul took a vow himself in the New Testament, and it talks about a point in time after Corinth when he shaved his head. And a lot of people think that Paul himself took a Nazarite vow and would have grown his hair out throughout his entire time in Corinth. So by the time Paul leaves, if Paul had no hair at the beginning, he's got 9 inches. If Paul had 3 inches of hair at the beginning, he's now got 12 inches of hair after taking that vow. And so from a spiritual point of view with the Bible, some of the most spiritual people, even men who took these vows, would oftentimes have long hair. Not to mention that in the Jewish culture, it was also culturally relevant for men to have long hair at that point in time. Probably one of the things that you see if you watch a movie or something that depicts Jesus' life or other people. They don't all have the short Roman haircuts. And so a lot of this is cultural. But the Bible never talks about people with long hair being more spiritual or less spiritual, or people with shorter hair, if they're men, being more spiritual or less spiritual. That's some other idea Paul's drawing on from some other place in culture or society. He wraps it up this way. He says, if anyone wants to argue about this, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Which is a strange way to end a conversation, because it's almost like saying, well, like if people want to argue, we don't really have anything concrete, right? He's gone to a lot of trouble to just land on this square at the very end of his conversation, of this short conversation. And so I think this is ultimately Paul's appeal to the Corinthians to restrict their freedoms out of love for each other, not because there's some rule or some expectation or other churches do it a certain way. Again, I think he's saying, consider your situation. And when it comes to your situation, what's going to bring the most honor to God and to each other in a church setting? I think Paul's suggestion is that that's going to be for the men to just not wear head coverings, which takes the whole honor game completely out of the picture. Everyone's on equal ground. And at the same time, as they reject the head coverings, to have the women, when they're participating and leading in worship, and for the married women, whenever they're in public, in general, to wear the head coverings, both as a symbol of honor for their husbands and their families, but also as a sign of authority, that they do have authority in a church setting to pray or prophesy. That's something that's okay for them. And so I think that that's Paul's suggestion, how they each should limit their freedoms in order to bring about unity, or as the title says, equality and authority in the worship setting. But he's not to the point where he's going to tell them what to do or say every church operates this way, which I think is helpful for us because every church doesn't operate the same way in our day and age as well. And so it's nice to have a little bit of leeway to assess our own cultural situations and needs. This has been a wild ride and maybe left you with more confusion than answers. Hopefully not. But again, that's my perspective based on the culture and what I'm seeing and how I'm seeing Corinthians unfold and play out. But other people will disagree, and you're free to as well. Here's what I would suggest as some questions we could ask ourselves in response to this. One, how can we promote and remind ourselves and onlookers, these messengers who might be talking about Mountain View and what happens here, of the equality and the authority of both men and women in our local church? Do we give off this aura that, that one group, one gender is above the other, or even within genders that, if you want to be really honorable at Mountain View, then you act this way, or you dress this way, or you talk this way, and, even among people of the same gender, this is how to get a leg up if you want to be really honored at Mountain View. All right? Are we looking at that, or are we looking at more of how we can promote equality and value among each other, but also direct our honor ultimately to God? Secondly, how can we honor one another in ways that ultimately honor God, which is kind of that summarized. And that can be a lot of ways of serving each other, or again, just seeing each other as people of value. Remember, in this gathering, both men and women were praying, and they were prophesying. They were taking an active role in the worship service. And this might have been different than what they would have experienced in their religious temples of Rome and Greece. And lastly, how can we be sensitive to our surrounding cultures? Because another aspect of this is if somebody walks into your church gathering and you're exercising liberty maybe as a woman to go uncovered even though you're married, how will society perceive that? Or on the other hand, as a man, you're not covering your head, even when you're praying and addressing a God. And that doesn't make sense culturally. And so, but it will cause people to think and to ask questions. And so how can we, engage with our surrounding culture, and what will people perceive, based on their perspectives if they walk into a service of Mountain View? And how can we either be considerate of that, or maybe sometimes push the boundaries just a little bit to show that things work a little bit differently when you're trying to live for Jesus and follow his way?